If we take spaces and flows, their meanings are shaped in the places that we inhabit, real spaces and of course virtual spaces. We see space, we also feel and manipulate objects in space, so spatial meanings are closely connected to visual and tactile meanings. We live and move about in space, we do things in space, and this moving and doing is episodic. It takes time and it happens in spatially framed sequences. The scope of this movement is influenced by the way space has been designed by people, or in the case of natural spaces, the meanings that we attribute to space, such as natural beauty and scientific interest.
What I want to do now is I want to apply the multiliteracy's grammar to spatial meanings. Remember, our objective is to try and build a grammar which applies to all these modes, as well, of course, wanting to highlight their differences. So, to refer, we might be referring in the physical structure of a building to a specific school, my school. No two schools are quite the same. This particular cafe, no two cafes are quite the same. This living room, no two living rooms are quite the same. So this is like a proper noun. The name of the cafe or the name of the school is a proper noun. And in fact, the process of us moving around these spaces is like a verb. I walk into the house, I go from the bedroom to the kitchen or whatever it is that I'm doing. These configure forms of action, which are sort of like verbs. But also we can have generalising concepts, schools in general. What are the characteristic features of all schools, which means that when you see a school, it's kind of recognisable. And when you see a cafe, you know it's not a school. What are the characteristics of living rooms in general? So this is a little bit like spatial versions of common nouns. Also, these spaces have characteristics. They might have sizes, they might have shapes, they might have colours, and those are attributes of the space. And also things sit in relationships. So, the kitchen and the dining room are near each other for a set of reasons. They're like prepositions. And also there are possessives in place. The kitchen has such and such a stove. There are a set of things which form possessive-like relationships in space. But also, these are spaces which configure dialogue. We saw the example there in the cafe or the street scene, and people are also positioned, in supermarkets, in a lecture theatre. You're positioned, and it's like mood and like voice. In language, the way in which you're positioned. So in a lecture theatre, you're positioned as the listener, and the person at the front standing down looking the other way is positioned as the speaker. So in other words, there's a set of dialogical relationships which by dialogue I don't mean literally speaking, I mean person-to-person relationships. First person, second person, third person, mood, voice, all those kinds of things, which are spatially configured without having to say a word, and also then, in fact, determine the words that might happen to be spoken in that space. Also, these are spaces that are structured. There are spatial arrangements, which are sort of like syntax. So what an architect does is the syntax of a building. What a landscape architect does is the syntax of a park. What a town planner does is the syntax of a city. And it might be many people building this syntax. And in fact, did we ever build the syntax of a sentence or a paragraph? It was sort of built for us and we learned how to do it. Someone else did it, but we're in it in the same way that we're in a park or in a city. And like media, there are materials. These things use materials. So we can analyse the materials that constitute that structure. Then it's also situated. So where is the space? The school's in a neighbourhood. The cafe is in a street. What's around it? How is that configured in not just in the meaning which is in the space itself, but configured by the relationship to the space that's around it? So that's the question of context or situation. So that's there in the same way that a piece of words sit in meaning, spoken words or written words sitting, or images are situated as well. So it's situated. And finally, there's intention going on. There's intention in the making of the space. So whoever wants to build the new school or the new cafe has a set of purposes in that building. But also there are purposes in the use of the space. When I go to the cafe and I I really want to go because I want internet access, as opposed to drinking a cup of coffee, and somebody else just goes because they want to have coffee and talk to each other. That we actually build our own intentions, our own purposes in these spaces in ways which are not always the same. So we have these different patterns of intention going on. I'm going to mention now just this idea of synesthesia and the way in which these different modes of meaning connect. And I think one of the most powerful signs that they do interconnect is the fact that we take spatial metaphors and we use them in language, right? So in other words, these things are in our vision, they're in our experience, and when we use language, we want to there's the power of those meanings that we then import into language via metaphor. So, for example, I could say, look, I'm in trouble. Well, in is in fact a metaphor. It's a spatial metaphor. Trouble then becomes like a space. There's trouble around me, and I am in trouble, right? I feel like an outsider. To be outside. It means that there are some people who are privileged and who are inside, and I'm outside. I've brought this spatial metaphor into my language, and in a way our language is full of things which are not congruent descriptions of things where sign and signifier line up, but they are a set of associations we use in language between things, meanings that are actually in the first instance experienced in space. I'm going to go through such and such a process. Well, through is a kind of the spatial equivalent of a verb. It describes a flow. What's the directionality of that flow? So what I'm really saying is that these meanings out there in the world, which are deep in our psyche, these senses of space in the world, and I mean literal physical space, buildings, landscapes, geographies. Those things we bring into our language because these are such deeply felt ways of understanding our world.